Welcome to the deep dive. Today we have a mission, and it's one that cuts straight through the usual fog of international relations. We want to give you, our listener, a really rapid but also comprehensive understanding of the sudden, extremely high-stakes confrontation between the United States and Cuba. And I want to stress that this is not some slow burn crisis that's been building for months. This is a sharp, almost instantaneous rupture.
Absolutely. It's been driven by a massive, and I think we can say very sudden geopolitical action.
Right. So our goal for you, the listener, is to move beyond just the headlines. We need to grasp what fundamentally changed, who is driving all the rhetoric we're hearing, and, crucially, what the immediate economic fallout means for Cuba.
The on-the-ground reality.
Exactly. And to do that, our source materials are live, they're current. We're looking at recent news reports, things that contain direct public statements from both President Trump and the Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel.
And we're filtering those through some critical perspectives from analysts. People at institutions like the University of Miami and the Center for Economic and Policy Research.
CEPR. Yeah.
CEPR, right. So we can get a sense of what the experts are thinking.
We're really trying to find the precise mechanisms of this coercion and, I guess, calculate the speed at which this whole crisis is accelerating.
And that speed, as you just said, is defined entirely by the timeline. We can pinpoint the exact moment this all became critical.
Okay.
It was that major U.S. military operation, the one that successfully captured President Nicolas Maduro in Caracas, Venezuela, on January 3rd.
Just a little over a week ago.
Exactly. And that action, you see, it didn't just remove a leader, it instantly severed the foundational economic and political ties that basically underpinned Cuba's stability for years.
It created a vacuum.
A huge vacuum, one that the U.S. administration immediately moved to fill with an ultimatum. And that's what transformed this decades-old, simmering tension into a hot diplomatic emergency.
That's the pivot point, isn't it? What we're watching now is the direct aftermath of that vacuum in Venezuela. The U.S. issued a clear, very public, and completely unconditional threat, an ultimatum, really.
Yeah, that's the right word for it.
And Cuba has met that with an equally public and, frankly, defiant denial of any formal high-level talks. And every single pressure point here, every lever being pulled, it's rooted in economics, the lifeblood of their subsidized oil, critical financial aid. It's all been instantly cut off.
Okay, let's unpack this, specifically the what now that follows that Caracas shockwave.
Right, and the so what, for you, the listener, is really understanding the sheer force of this geopolitical domino effect. The operation in Venezuela, it wasn't just a surgical strike. It was more like a structural demolition of the regional anti-U.S. alliance.
So for Cuba, the immediate capture of Maduro means what?
It means the evaporation of their most vital economic lifeline overnight.
This forces an immediate, and I'm sure agonizing, reassessment of their entire political calculus. How do they replace, 70% of their secure fuel supply?
And where do they even start to look?
Exactly. What risks are they willing to take or avoid to try and stabilize their already failing infrastructure? You see, analyzing the loss of that Venezuelan support completely transforms the way we have to look at Cuba's defiance.
So?
Well, it might sound strong on the surface, all this defiant rhetoric, but it's a defiance that is absolutely rooted in deep, deep economic fear.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, the direct trigger. That U.S. military action on January 3rd, 2026 in Caracas. Our sources are describing it as a stunning operation.
And that word choice, stunning, it really speaks to the scale of it and the complete unexpectedness of the event.
The result was immediate and profound. The capture of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores.
And they are now facing, as we said, drug trafficking and other really serious charges within the U.S. judicial system.
The fact that the U.S. chose to execute this operation right inside Venezuela's capital city, that sends an undeniable signal, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a signal of its commitment to regime change pressure across the entire region. It's a message to everyone.
But this operation, it came at a cost that goes far beyond just removing the Venezuelan leadership.
A human cost.
A very specific human cost. The sources we have confirm that the operation resulted in 32 Cuban officers being killed during that U.S. action in Caracas.
And this is a critical detail. You can't overstate how important this is. It immediately lifts this whole confrontation beyond a mere economic dispute or some, diplomatic squabble.
It's personal now.
It's personal, and it's a direct casualty count. These are soldiers of the Cuban regime lost on foreign soil during an operation that they were reportedly helping to manage.
That casualty figure has to be the single most inflammatory component of this crisis for Havana.
I would argue it is. When we talk about 32 officers, we're not talking about regular conscripts. We're referencing a very specific, likely highly trained cohort.
People probably involved in managing Venezuela's security apparatus.
Exactly. And these were officers killed by direct U.S. action. The Cuban leadership simply cannot ignore that loss. There's no way.
It turns the diplomatic standoff into something else.
It turns it into a blood feud. It reinforces the Cuban government's entire narrative that the U.S. is engaged in direct military aggression, even if that aggression took place in a third country.
And it must make any path to normalization, regardless of the economic pressure, just incredibly difficult.
It complicates it immensely. Now, the U.S. administration, led by President Trump, was very quick to articulate the justification for why Cuba was involved in Venezuela in the first place.
Right, and why Cuba is the immediate next target.
The narrative was laid out explicitly on Truth Social. Trump's claim is that Cuba survived for years on massive quantities of oil and money.
In all caps, I assume.
Of course,
Yeah.
all caps, oil and money flowing freely from Venezuela. And in return for this huge subsidy, the U.S. alleges that Cuba provided security services.
So, protecting the last two Venezuelan dictators.
That's the framing. This establishes the U.S. position that the entire relationship was transactional, it was exploitative, and fundamentally illegitimate.
And that framing is absolutely essential for the U.S. political case, isn't it?
It's everything.
It transforms what was, a complex ideological relationship into a very simple, almost criminal quid pro quo, oil for security.
But Cuba's response was just as swift and a complete and total rejection of that entire premise.
Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez.
Yes, he immediately issued a formal denial. He stated unequivocally that Cuba has never received monetary or material compensation for the security services it has provided to any country.
So here we are. This is where the diplomatic impasse begins.
That's it.
The U.S. insists the relationship was mercenary, driven by money. Cuba insists it was a relationship of sovereign solidarity, an ideological alliance provided without charge.
And for the U.S., severing that financial link is just stopping a criminal enterprise. But for Cuba, the U.S. action is a direct attack on their sovereignty and their right to choose their own regional partners.
And just 2 days after the Venezuela operation, on that Sunday, President Trump followed up the military action with that very public and completely uncompromising threat directed right at Havana.
The unconditional ultimatum we mentioned.
Exactly. The message was unambiguous. There will be no more oil or money going to Cuba, zero.
Leaving no room for interpretation on the economic consequence.
None at all. But what makes the threat so, I think, effective is the vagueness of the terms for relief.
He just says.
He issues a sharp warning. I strongly suggest they make a deal before it is too late.
Oh, what is the deal?
That's the thing. There's a striking absence of any detail about what this deal even entails. Is it political reform? Is it the withdrawal of any remaining security personnel? The handover of political prisoners? We don't know.
Which means the threat is the consequence. The Cuban government is left to guess at the cost of the ransom, while the clock on their economy just ticks down.
Our sources suggest that ambiguity is intentional. It's the lever of power.
Of course. It's designed to compel internal debate, maybe even paranoia, inside Havana. It paralyzes any long-term planning.
And it's crucial to place this action within the president's renewed geopolitical philosophy, the one he's publicly revived and rebranded.
We are talking about the Monroe Doctrine.
Which he now refers to as the Monroe Doctrine.
Right.
Historically, the Monroe Doctrine was mainly defensive, right? It was intended to warn external European powers against interfering in the affairs of sovereign nations in the Western Hemisphere.
That's the textbook definition, yes.
But this modern reinterpretation seems entirely different. It's explicitly focused on establishing and enforcing U.S. supremacy.
And specifically through the lens of combating drug trafficking.
Which aligns perfectly with the capture of Maduro on drug charges, despite all the underlying political aims.
It provides the public justification. If we delve deeper into what this Monroe Doctrine really implies, the key difference is a shift from preventing external interference to actively initiating internal intervention.
Either military or economic.
Right. Against sovereign states within the hemisphere that do not align with U.S. interests. Venezuela was a shocking, and I think for many, terrifying, demonstration of this new mandate.
And that demonstration immediately broadened the focus. It didn't stop with Venezuela.
Not at all. It was about establishing a clear pattern. If we connect this to the bigger picture, our sources highlight that the pressure immediately pivoted to Colombia.
Trump publicly floated the idea that a military operation targeting Colombia.
Sounds good. His words.
And this wasn't just idle talk. He followed it up with targeted sanctions on President Gustavo Petro.
Who is Colombia's first left-wing leader.
Right. And the allegation was that Petro was allowing drug cartels to flourish.
So you see the template.
It's a clear operational template for the Donroe Doctrine. You identify an ideological opponent, you link their governance to the drug trade, and then you use that as the justification for unilateral sanctions or military threats.
Cuba is currently suffering the economic arm of this policy. Colombia is certainly feeling the heat as well.
And let's not forget Mexico.
Even U.S. neighbors have been placed under immense pressure. Trump complained that drugs were pouring across the border.
And he went so far as to offer to deploy U.S. troops inside Mexico to combat the cartels.
Which President Claudia Sheinbaum was very firm in her rejection of. She publicly rejected any U.S. military presence on Mexican soil.
And that rejection is significant. It shows that even nations with historically complex relationships with the U.S. are resisting the scope of this new strategy.
Mexico and Colombia are pushing back on the military aspect, but Cuba is caught in the economic crosshairs right now.
So the Venezuela operation, at the end of the day, it wasn't an endpoint.
Not at all. It was the forceful start of a regional strategy, and Cuba has been clearly designated as the immediate next target for compliance.
So following that very public, high-pressure ultimatum from Washington, the Cuban government's counter-response was delivered with equal clarity and speed. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel, he used X to deliver a whole flurry of statements the very next day, on Monday.
Right, trying to control the narrative.
And the central message was one of absolute defiance. His administration is unequivocally not in talks with the U.S. government about the ultimatum.
So they're refusing to be seen as capitulating under duress.
Exactly.
And this immediate public denial, it serves several strategic purposes. First, it's about maintaining internal control. It reinforces that whole revolutionary narrative of standing up to U.S. aggression.
And second,
it's an attempt to set the terms of the conversation globally. It signals that Cuba views the U.S. ultimatum as illegal economic coercion, not as some kind of legitimate diplomatic outreach.
but there is a crucial, very specific caveat in there that prevents a total communications freeze. Díaz-Canel made sure to highlight it.
The migration channel.
Right. Technical contacts in the area of migration are ongoing. This small channel is the single thread that remains intact.
And that distinction is fascinating, isn't it? It's profoundly strategic.
Why keep that one door open?
Well, think about it. Both countries have a compelling, immediate interest in preventing chaotic, uncontrolled movement of people. For the U.S., uncontrolled migration creates a huge domestic political crisis, often used by hardliners.
Right.
And for Cuba, if they completely halt cooperation, they surrender all control over who leaves and under what circumstances. That could encourage mass, really dangerous maritime departures.
So while the high-level political negotiations about ideology are frozen,
The practical mechanisms necessary for both countries' internal stability remain functional. It suggests a recognition, however grudging, that some level of operational stability is mutually beneficial, even in the middle of a crisis like this.
and if we analyze the conditions Cuba sets for any future dialogue, it just reveals the depth of their resistance. Díaz-Canel was explicit. For relations to resume, they have to be based on the principles of international law. He's rejecting the current foundation of hostility, threats, and economic coercion.
He's trying to shift the focus from U.S. domestic demands to international norms of conduct.
The conditions are really detailed and, from Havana's perspective, non-negotiable.
They're demanding discussions based on sovereign equality, mutual respect, principles of international law, and mutual benefit.
And most critically, they insist these talks must happen without interference in internal affairs and with full respect for our independence.
Which is, in essence, Cuba demanding that the U.S. recognize the legitimacy of their socialist political model, not just tolerate it as some temporary failure that's waiting to collapse.
And this unified stance was immediately reposted and supported by Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez.
Confirming that the leadership is in lockstep on this.
The defiance wasn't just political either. It hit the economic weapon directly.
Oil cutoff.
Exactly. Foreign Minister Rodriguez was quick to address it, asserting Cuba's absolute right. He stated that Cuba has the absolute right to import fuel from any willing exporter.
Without interference or subordination to the unilateral coercive measures of the United States.
And then he deployed a sharp counter-accusation, basically characterizing the U.S. action as fundamentally illegitimate.
Yeah, he stated that unlike the U.S., Cuba does not lend itself to blackmail or military coercion against other states.
Which is a rhetorical move that attempts to win the global narrative, right? Casting the United States as the aggressor, violating international norms, and painting Cuba as the principled victim standing up for the rule of law.
Right, so you have this very public, absolute denial of talks in response to the ultimatum. But the big question is this genuine resistance, or is it a delay tactic?
What do the experts think?
Well, Andy S. Gomez, a senior fellow in Cuban studies at the University of Miami, he offered some critical insight into the government's likely internal calculus. He views Díaz-Canel's public comments as, and I'm quoting here, a way to try and buy a little bit of time for the inner circle to decide what steps it's going to take.
So it's political theater.
An exercise in political theater designed to gain internal consensus and just delay having to make a truly painful decision.
Gomez also expressed some deep skepticism about Cuba's willingness to fundamentally shift its diplomatic posture, even under this kind of intense pressure.
He did. He referenced the previous diplomatic opening during the Obama administration. He noted that despite that huge opportunity for normalized relations, the Cuban side, well, he said they didn't even bring Cuban coffee to the table.
It's a great line.
It's a great line. And that anecdote suggests a long-standing, really deep-seated institutional reluctance within the regime to engage with the U.S. on an equal footing. They often view any U.S. diplomatic overture as a kind of Trojan horse for political subversion.
But the economic stakes now are just. They're orders of magnitude higher than they were under Obama.
A whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
And Gomez acknowledges this profound change. He concludes his assessment by emphasizing that, despite all the public defiance, these truly are desperate times for Cuba.
So the defiance is necessary for national pride?
But the economic necessity to find a solution or a new patron is just completely overwhelming.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because we move from the rhetoric and the history to the immediate brutal realities facing Cuba right now. And this is what fundamentally differentiates the current moment from previous U.S.-Cuba confrontations. The abrupt severance of that Venezuelan economic lifeline. It's not just a policy shift.
No, it's the immediate collapse of a foundational pillar that was supporting the entire island's infrastructure.
Let's talk numbers, the scale of this loss. Venezuela was supplying an estimated 35,000 barrels of oil a day before the U.S. attack.
35,000 barrels. And that line has now flatlined. It aligns exactly with President Trump's decree of zero oil going to Cuba.
To give you, the listener, a sense of this magnitude, that 35,000 barrels a day is approximately 70% of Cuba's guaranteed subsidized fuel imports.
70%.
Imagine a developed nation instantly losing 70% of its national fuel supply. The economy would just stall overnight.
And we really have to talk about the nature of that oil. This wasn't something they were buying at market rate with hard currency.
No, for years, the Venezuelan supply was heavily subsidized.
It was often supplied through a kind of barter arrangement, where Cuba would send thousands of doctors, teachers, and critically security personnel to Venezuela in exchange for that oil.
So that arrangement made the oil essentially immune to international market fluctuations.
And immune to U.S. currency pressure. When you lose this supply, you don't just lose oil. You lose the only sustainable model you had for getting oil without needing billions in foreign currency reserves.
Which Cuba simply doesn't have.
They don't have it. Furthermore, the U.S. administration isn't just relying on the vacuum created by Maduro's capture. They are actively closing down alternative supply routes.
Tanker seizures.
Yes, the tactic of confiscating sanctioned Venezuelan oil tankers has been intensified. Our sources confirm a recent seizure of a fifth tanker.
And that action sends a clear signal to any other shipping company or nation thinking about helping Cuba.
It's a huge signal. The risk of losing your valuable assets to U.S. sanctions enforcement is very high. This effectively shrinks Cuba's global market options and makes the logistical and financial challenge of replacing that 35,000 barrel a day gap almost insurmountable.
So let's quantify the remaining lifeline. We have some expert analysis from Jorge Piñón at the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. He tracks these shipments.
Right.
So we know Cuba lost 35,000 barrels a day from Venezuela. Piñón's data shows the remaining secure imports are, well, they're minimal by comparison.
What are we talking about?
Roughly 5,500 barrels daily from Mexico and about 7,500 from Russia.
So that's a total of 13,000 barrels a day.
which leaves a colossal immediate shortfall of 22,000 barrels that the Cuban economy must somehow absorb or find right now.
Which makes the role of Mexico, historically a small but friendly supplier, incredibly important.
Right. So Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum was questioned about potentially increasing shipments to fill that Venezuelan gap.
And her response was very guarded. She declined to give specific data on current shipments or confirm any future increases.
She just insisted the aid has been ongoing for a long time. It's not new.
Which sounds like she's trying to downplay the severity of the commitment, or maybe avoid provoking a direct response from the U.S.
And while Sheinbaum expressed this, diplomatic confidence, claiming Mexico's fuel supply to Cuba isn't a concern because there is enough oil,
The economic reality of Mexico itself kind of undermines that confidence.
that's what the source material points out. Production from the state-owned Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex, is steadily declining.
So Mexico might offer a lot of political goodwill, but it appears structurally and logistically incapable of replacing 35,000 barrels a day for any length of time. They can provide a trickle, but not the flood that Cuba desperately needs.
And the devastating context here is that this oil shortage is landing on an economy that was already facing a severe internal collapse.
Absolutely. The sources confirm that even with the Venezuelan oil flowing, Cuba was struggling with chronic, widespread blackouts.
Because of fuel shortages and a drastically crumbling, outdated electric grid.
So this loss of fuel now pushes their entire infrastructure, transportation, electricity, manufacturing into a highly precarious, possibly non-functional state. The infrastructure was already running on fumes.
And now the fumes are gone.
Pretty much. And to understand the root causes of this deep economic malaise, we have to look beyond just the immediate oil shock. The economy was already crippled by the paralysis that set in during the COVID-19 pandemic.
And that was followed by a radical, systemic increase in U.S. sanctions imposed during and after the first Trump administration.
And these sanctions weren't aimed at just minor diplomatic discomfort. They were designed specifically to create enough pressure to force a fundamental change in Cuba's socialist political model.
And when you actually quantify the total financial costs of these sanctions, the numbers are just terrifying.
Yeah.
The Cuban government estimates that U.S. sanctions cost the country more than $7.5 billion.
That's between March 2024 and February 2025 alone, just 1 year.
To illustrate the magnitude of that figure for Cuba's small, centralized economy, you have to consider this. The island's absolute peak tourism revenue, its main source of foreign currency in the last decade, was only about $3 billion annually.
Wow. So the cost of sanctions is more than double their best-case scenario earnings.
Exactly. Losing $7.5 billion means far more than just a line item on a budget.
Right. It represents their inability to get international loans, their denial of access to global banking systems.
The inflated costs of importing basic necessities like food and medicine because they have to rely on distant, risk-taking third-party carriers.
And the complete strangulation of any foreign investment. The situation is structurally insolvent.
And this structural insolvency, it translates directly into a profound human cost.
The migration crisis.
The migration crisis. Our sources note that the existing economic strain had already triggered a massive wave of migration, overwhelmingly targeting the United States.
Right. And historically, Cubans had a privileged status as political exiles in the U.S.
Though those specific privileges were significantly curtailed before the Trump administration tightened the border controls.
So the sudden, intense economic shock from the oil cutoff is the perfect storm. You have the economic despair, combined with a perceived political opening in the U.S. to address migration. It means this already substantial migration wave is almost guaranteed to accelerate dramatically.
People are literally running out of options to feed their families and just keep the lights on.
Okay, let's pivot now to the negotiating calculus. Let's analyze the incentives and the disincentives for both Washington and Havana.
From the U.S. perspective, the timing and the leverage seem overwhelmingly favorable.
They are. Michael Gallant, a senior research associate at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR, he argues very clearly that the U.S. is not operating under any sense of urgency at all.
No reason to.
Gallant's assessment is that the U.S. strategy is brutally simple. Trump is hoping to deepen the economic crisis on the island, and there are a few costs to Trump to try and wait that out.
So the cost of waiting for the U.S. is negligible, whereas for Cuba, it's catastrophic.
Exactly. Which leads him to the conclusion that there will be no dramatic action in the coming days because there is no rush to come to the table.
Washington believes the laws of economic gravity will eventually force Cuba to comply with this unspecified deal.
They're just waiting them out. And U.S. officials are not being subtle about this strategy.
Yep.
They're actively using rhetoric that's designed to provoke internal panic within the Cuban leadership.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio, for example, who's a key figure in U.S. Latin American policy.
He indicated publicly that Cuban leaders should be profoundly concerned. He even went so far as to state explicitly that he would be in a lot of trouble if you were currently working in the Cuban government.
That is an intentional effort to sow discord and panic at the very top.
No question. And then we saw that piece of politically charged symbolism aimed directly at Cuba's future.
When President Trump reposted a social media message
That suggested Rubio, who is, of course, of Cuban-American heritage, could potentially become the next president of Cuba.
and he added the casual comment, "Sounds good to me."
Right. And this is more than just political banter. It's a deliberate public framing of the U.S. goal.
It's not just about diplomatic change or policy concessions.
No, it's about explicit regime change and the installation of a leader who is favorable to Washington.
So despite this overwhelming pressure and the immediate collapse of their oil supply, we have to come back to this question of Cuba's internal willingness to negotiate.
Especially given their fierce public defiance.
Right. Gallant suggests that beneath that hard line, Cuba might actually be receptive. He notes they've shown consistent interest in finding ways to ease sanctions.
And that, quote, it's not that Cuba is uncooperative. They understand the economic realities. They have to.
So if negotiations were ever to take place, what would be on the table?
The most likely topics would center on areas of mutual structural needs, so migration and security.
These are the areas where the U.S. has pressing domestic concerns, especially with border stability.
And where Cuba desperately needs the stability of a managed process. As Andy S. Gomez emphasized earlier, regardless of the revolutionary rhetoric, these are indeed desperate times for Cuba.
And that desperation provides the only real incentive for them to approach a negotiating table that is currently tilted so heavily in Washington's favor.
So that's the only card they have to play, really.
And this entire standoff is fundamentally defined by these clashing political ideologies, by the Cuban regime's fierce commitment to self-determination.
You can see it in Diaz-Canel's counter-rhetoric. The depth of the antagonism is clear when he lashes out at the U.S., stating, "Those who turn everything into a business, even human lives, have no moral authority to point fingers at Cuba for anything."
Which targets the absolute heart of the conflict, Cuba's sovereign decision to choose their political model.
Havana is framing this as a fight for national self-determination against external economic and military coercion. And that's a narrative that resonates deeply within the island, given their history.
This raises an important question, especially when we connect this back to the sanctions regime.
Right. The strained relationship, of course, it goes all the way back to Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution, which overthrew the U.S.-backed government.
And while relations briefly thawed under President Obama,
the current administration has systematically reversed all of those moves, using very specific legal mechanisms to cripple the economy.
And the most powerful of these economic barriers is the reinstatement of Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism.
Yes, a status the administration reimposed shortly after being sworn in for its second term. And it is vital that you, the listener, understand why this is such an effective economic weapon.
What does it actually do?
This designation, it prevents Cuba from accessing most international banking and financial services. It blocks loans from major institutions like the World Bank and the IMF.
And it imposes severe penalties on third-party companies that engage in trade or investment with the island.
It's a financial chokehold. It makes it nearly impossible for Cuba to trade in U.S. dollars, to secure reliable supply chains, or to attract the foreign investment they so desperately need to upgrade their failing infrastructure.
So that designation alone ensures that the diplomatic and economic barriers are higher now than they have been in decades.
It's the linchpin of the entire pressure campaign.
So while this diplomatic and financial war rages in Washington and Havana, it's really critical to anchor ourselves back to the reality on the ground.
What it feels like to be there.
Right. Our sources report that despite the massive geopolitical pressure and the sudden loss of fuel, for many Cubans, life generally went on as usual.
Which is a testament to the resilience and maybe the deep-seated exhaustion with perpetual crisis on the island.
But beneath that surface, the tensions absolutely dominate public conversation.
That's the key distinction. Just because the economy is collapsing doesn't mean civil life stops. It just means it gets harder and harder every day.
And the sources capture this complexity, noting that in Cuba, people talk and talk. The crisis is the constant background hum of daily existence.
So we need to synthesize the range of opinions that are dominating that local chatter because they really illustrate the difficulty the regime faces in maintaining stability.
On one hand, you see a clear and a palpable desire for fundamental change.
And it's driven by years of economic stagnation and hardship, which is now just massively exacerbated by the oil cutoff.
Arady Guzman, a 32-year-old food delivery person, he articulated the sentiment very clearly. He said he doesn't necessarily want military intervention or bad things to happen.
But if something has to happen, the people deserve change.
And that statement reveals a population that is desperate enough to welcome major external shifts, as long as those shifts promise some kind of economic relief from the current system.
It's a crucial vulnerability for the regime.
Then you have the other perspective, one that combines deep concern with a kind of cynical, historical skepticism about U.S. intentions.
Right. The homemaker, Mylene Gomez. She was 37. She was already preparing for the worst, showing this ingrained understanding of the volatile nature of U.S. policy under the current administration.
She acknowledged the unpredictability of it all, noting that Trump, he'll find entertainment anywhere.
But significantly, she tempered her fear. She added that she didn't believe the U.S. would actually invade Cuba.
And this response, it highlights the cultural memory of the Bay of Pigs, the historical reluctance of the U.S. to engage in a full military invasion of the island.
So while the threats of economic coercion are entirely real, there's a deep-seated belief that direct military action is just too risky.
The primary fear is economic strangulation, not necessarily ground troops.
Exactly. And finally, you see the traditional fierce Cuban defiance, a deep patriotism rooted in national identity, which is what the leadership has to rely on.
The bartender, Ruben Benitez, 57 years old. He summed up this hard line of defense, and he provided a specific, evocative number for the resistance.
He stated that if push came to shove, 11, 8, or 9 million will take to the streets to defend what little we have left.
That's nearly the entire population of the island.
It's a powerful symbolic defense. It confirms that the commitment to sovereignty runs deep within segments of the population, regardless of how economically desperate the situation becomes.
It's a clear message to Washington.
A very clear message. While the economy may be easily broken, the national will is not.
So you have this mix of desperation for economic change, skepticism about external military action, and a fierce commitment to national defense.
It creates a highly volatile political atmosphere on the island.
Andy S. Gomez's final assessment of the overall diplomatic climate certainly captures that sense of uncertainty and profound danger. He described the current state of relations as just very sad and concerning.
So, what does this all mean when we synthesize this entire deep dive? What's the takeaway?
The analysis confirms that this crisis is not accidental or just diplomatic. It is immediate, it is severe, and it was deliberately manufactured.
Manufactured through rapid, overwhelming economic coercion, following a decisive military action in a third country.
And the stakes are quantified and brutal. The abrupt loss of 70% of Cuba's guaranteed fuel imports.
The ongoing economic drain of over $7.5 billion in sanction costs every year.
And the resulting acceleration of a migration wave that will inevitably challenge the stability of both nations.
And the diplomatic landscape? It's defined by this absolute and immediate contrast. You have President Trump's unconditional ultimatum demanding zero oil and a deal before it is too late.
Versus President Diaz-Canel's conditional offer for dialogue, insisting it has to be based exclusively on sovereign equality, mutual respect, and zero interference in internal affairs.
And those two positions are completely incompatible.
Which means that the full force of the economic weapon will continue to be deployed against the island until one side cracks.
And that leads us to the final provocative thought for you to consider as you process this deep dive. We noted that the only confirmed channel of communication that remains active is the technical contacts in the area of migration.
Right.
So, given that the U.S. strategy relies on deepening the crisis to force compliance, how much of the current intense economic pressure, the deliberate timing of the oil cutoff, and the continued enforcement of the sanctions, how much of that is designed specifically to accelerate the rate of migration?
So, is this coercion ultimately intended to flood the U.S. with migrants?
To force a domestic political crisis that, in turn, compels the U.S. to negotiate terms that are favorable to Washington. Using human movement as its ultimate political currency, it's a chilling calculation of strategic leverage.